Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our evening installment of the Member Speaker Series. My name is Kate Gleason, and I'm the Membership Director here at the Garden. I'm so delighted to welcome you tonight. We had more than 300 members sign up for this special presentation with award-winning photographer Ian Shive. Before I introduce Ian, let me update you on a couple other upcoming events. First of all, the next installment of our virtual Member Speaker Series will take place on Tuesday, August 3rd. We'll be back to our usual 11 a.m. format. The program's going to feature Colin Wellenkamp. Colin is the executive director of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, a coalition of more than 100 municipalities and mayors along the river that work together to promote economic and environmental security and stability in their own river cities and towns. Registration for this free virtual program, like all speaker series, is available online, or you can call the phone number on the back of your membership office or register with a membership person next time you're here at the Garden. I'm also excited to tell you about the return of our annual festivals. You probably saw in your e-news and in our bulletin that we're going to welcome back Chinese Culture Days on April 7th and 8th, Japanese Festival over Labor Day weekend, and of course my favorite, the Best of Missouri Market on October 1st through 3rd. As a member, you receive half-price tickets to each of these weekend festivals. Of course, if you're at the festival member, if you're a festival level or higher, you do receive 6 free tickets to each and every festival. Advanced tickets for Chinese Culture Days just went on sale yesterday, so you can log on online to secure those. Give us a call or again, stop by the Garden to obtain those tickets. Advanced tickets are not required at the festivals. Just like before, you can come without a ticket and attend any of them, but I do recommend, with the restrictions we have in place, some capacity limits, and of course our safe social distancing, the best thing to do is get those tickets in advance to make your entry as quick and smooth as possible. Now it's my great privilege to introduce Ian Shive. Ian is an Ansel Adams award-winning photographer and filmmaker whose work documents some of the world's most pristine environments and brings to the public important conservation stories from around the globe. In 2020, Ian launched a new digital series on the Discovery Channel titled Nature in Focus, where he explores our planet as host and executive producer. In March of this year, Ian took audiences to a protected and remote area of Alaska with the launch of his documentary, The Last Unknown, which is now streaming on Discovery Plus. Ian is the author of several best-selling books, including the award-winning The National Parks: An American Legacy, and his latest book, which was released in October, entitled Refuge, America's Wildest Places, which celebrates the National Wildlife Refuge System. Ian's work has been critically acclaimed in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Smithsonian Magazine, CNN, and countless other media outlets. Since 2010, Ian has worked as the CEO of the company he founded, Tandem Stills and Motion, a leading health, fitness, and environmental media company. Ian resides in and is speaking to us tonight from Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Ian for his presentation and a brief Q&A that will end the program as time allows. We've enabled the Q&A function on Zoom, so simply type any questions you have throughout the evening and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Thank you as always for your membership support, and welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Kate. I appreciate it. Thank you so much to the Missouri Botanical Garden for having me here today, this evening. It's still afternoon for us here in Los Angeles. Yeah. An evening, and a little bit of evening over there, a little bit of time travel with our presentation. And I'm really excited to share my work. I love how we're able to connect in new ways like this, during these times. And it's kind of wild for me because it's really the first time in almost 20 years, really, that I haven't traveled for such a long time. I actually got on a plane. I think it was first time in 20 years. It was 5 weeks ago. And then before that, it was, before all this started, it was like 17 months of being home. So in the spirit of botanical gardens and gardens in particular, I actually had a garden for the first time in 20 years as well. So it's been a lot of changes for me and focusing a lot of my lens on things closer to home over the last year. But we'll be taking a journey that's really anything but close to a lot of our homes this evening. And where I really want to start is I do work as a filmmaker. I'm going to be really sharing a lot of photographs tonight. Working both as a filmmaker and photographer, and my work with Discovery is very much about both. And ironically, that was always sort of the vision of what I had hoped to do with my career. I started in the film industry, working in marketing at a major movie studio and a lot of really popular films like the Spider-Man franchise and things like that. And after almost a decade of doing it, realized that, I loved it, but I really wanted to merge it with my passion for being outdoors and being in nature. And I like storytelling and photography, and I like the experience of being out there myself. But I also like the idea of being able to share it through these different mediums, which is how the idea of Tandem, then my company, came together. It was the idea of both photos and film working together, all of us people working together, biologists, scientists, organizations, to share our wild places. And so I've gone on this incredible journey since then. Don't remember exactly how many years it's been. I don't count always 2020 when I'm doing the math on my years, but I think it's been almost 15 years or more, 16, 17, almost 17 years, I guess, since I began the journey I'll be sharing with you tonight. And you see this picture here. That's actually me in the field working with a cinema camera in front of these guys. This is the actual shot that. Oops, hold on. Let's see if we can get this to. There we go. This is the actual shot that I was able to get out of it. And these are Laysan albatross. And this photo, this trip to what is Midway Atoll, it's an island halfway across the Pacific, which I'll talk about in a little bit, really was a major changing point in how my work and my focus shifted as a nature photographer and as a conservation photographer. But really my roots began with just pretty landscapes. I love pretty landscape photos. I'm a landscape photographer. I consider myself a landscape photographer first and foremost, even more so than wildlife. I love wildlife. I'll definitely be prepared to get the shot if it comes along, but my focus has always been about making those calendar images. And that's how my career started. It really started as a hobby. For many years, I'm the son of a photographer, so I've always been focused on photography, and a lot of my skills were formed here in this location. A lot of people think this is an aerial. It's actually not. It's an overlook called Inspiration Point in Channel Islands National Park, not far from my home here in Los Angeles. Most people don't realize this island is 30 miles from the mainland here. So you've got Hollywood on one end, and you've got these more or less uninhabited islands in the national park just across the channel there. And this is the kind of work I really wanted to set out to make, things that would be part of a calendar, really looking for technically proficient imagery. And that meant sharpness, meant drama, a lot of high-end sort of conceptualization of how to present a specific idea or image. This image from Organ Pipe Cactus in Arizona, it's a national monument, it was one I had thought of, but was very difficult to make because it's very close to the border. So a lot of drones and border patrol sorts of lights going through the night sky. It's not even night. So it's really, a lot of this is taken right at the very end of the day, hence the blue color in the sky. You have a very narrow window of time that you're able to capture the shot. And then figuring out, finding that iconic cactus with the arm sticking out and all that. And so that was a lot of my approach. As well as just putting myself in the right place at the right time. One question I get a lot about this photo from Logan Pass and Glacier National Park is that I add the mountain goat into the shot, and I did not. They're always up there. They tend to get a little too close sometimes, but this was just right time, right place. And in fact, none of my images do I add skies or clouds? Maybe I've done a few things just to try it artistically and for fun, but I just don't find the enjoyment in it. I find that nature really doesn't need embellishment. I really think that half the fun is finding those extraordinary moments as they happen, but also putting yourself in situations where extraordinary moments can happen. And for me, that first love of photographing the outdoors and what became pretty much the first half of my career as a photographer was in America's national parks. And I really wanted to focus on not just the icons, but also the lesser known moments and lesser known aspects of the National Park Service story and National Park System story. So I put myself in places like this, Lake Clark National Park in Alaska. I found myself up there in the middle of January when you only have, 4 or 5 hours of sunlight, and all of it looks like sunset. And so I went to this small town in Lake Clark, and it was me and maybe 5 other people in the whole town. town, maybe not the right word, and rented an airplane, took the doors off, and 60 below zero, we flew around the tops of these mountain volcanoes. This is Mount Iliamna in the distance, photographing these peaks in this incredible light, while the snot froze to the side of my face in the extreme cold. It was very, very challenging, but it also yielded images that I knew I really couldn't find by just sticking to the road or sticking to the trail. Though I've always loved the classics and in places like Teton and getting out early and to get that sunrise. I always joke I'm not terribly keen on sunrises, even though they're absolutely beautiful. I'm not a morning person. So a lot of my images, I always joke, a lot of my books and my work is really sunsets of the national parks or sunsets of the national wildlife refuges. I also really, in this same time of photographing the national parks, and this is again in Channel Islands National Park, fell in love with underwater photography, which went on to become one of the major aspects of my career. And so photographing California sea lions off the side of Anacapa Island, just 30 feet of water, and the captain bangs on the hole and they all come over because they know people are there and they're curious, and swirling and swarming around the lens. Really just became these incredible opportunities for me personally to experience nature and looking for those otherworldly moments. Yellowstone always looks like another planet to me. And, it's important to remember that it isn't another planet. It's the planet we're all on sharing together. As well as blending the artistic sort of styles, soft focus, looking at sort of the greeting card imagery. But what I think happened along the way is, especially as I started getting assignments for magazines, was that I realized that it wasn't just a landscape story, it wasn't just a nature and wildlife story, but that all of these stories really are people's stories. And it's not just how we interact with the places, but also how we react to the actual images themselves. And one of the things I learned, this is in Mojave National Preserve, one of the things I learned early with an image, this particular image on the screen, was that when images didn't feel like the people in them didn't feel like they were a distinct individual, that the viewer was sort of living vicariously through that. If you can imagine the same image without the person, it's good, but it's not great. But when you have the person in it, you can understand the scale of the place. You start to maybe equate sort of a personal feeling with the moment. And so I started to recognize that I was getting much stronger reactions to my work online and in print when they had a little bit of a human element in it. And so I started to really look at how to introduce that, but do it in a way that it didn't feel always super specific. A lot of the work obviously can be specific, but the stuff that I was really trying to convey, this is in Big Bend National Park, Texas, that's Mexico on the left, United States on the right, was trying to figure out how to still capture magical moments, keep people in it, but maybe not feel like an individual, so you don't lose that separation that you say, well, that's not me, or that can't be me. I want everyone to feel like this could be them, and this is the experience that these places offer. And so I started looking at that. This was a huge turning point. The very early of my assignment days of photographing search and rescue on it was Mount McKinley and Denali, had two sort of names at the time. It's now Denali, the highest mountain in North America. And this was the view as we went in for a landing on an active glacier. And I wanted to just put people right in the action, get real close into it, make you feel like you're there along for the ride, which is a theme to this day for all of my work, stylistically as well as the technical approach. But you'll see sort of the recurring, single person in a landscape throughout a lot of the images. That was the Everglades before. This is in Crater Lake National Park here, and it takes a minute before you see the person. But there they are, way over to the left in a red jacket. Just standing out against the horizon a little bit. It just adds that extra little bit of layer to the image, and helps you sort of fit yourself into all of it. And so the human story has become a major part of everything that I do. And now even more so, it's actually become a lot about my personal human story and experiences going into these places. Love sand dunes. It's kind of a sidebar to that, but at Death Valley National Park here, at sunset, and again, shape, line, symmetry, color, texture, people, where everything falls in the frame is something that I'm always looking at, figuring out what just feels right organically. And, there's a lot of trial and error. I always say that I'm less of a photographer and honestly much more of a curator, in taking lots of images, but really narrowing down to very specific feelings and emotions in the image that I want to share with people. This is great sand dunes in Colorado. And so the national parks are sort of the obvious place to really work, especially as a nature photographer. If you're looking for those iconic grand moments, it's already, to use the word curated, it's already in many ways been curated for you. You kind of know what you're going to see to some degree, as far as, looking at an arch or going to Old Faithful or something like that. I mean, there's always the wild card of weather and wildlife, but it's fairly predictable and fairly, very busy, certainly these days as well, just tons and tons of people. This was an early selfie of me because I felt like it really needed a human in the image to capture the scale of the experience. And the national parks are where I published a couple of books, and they did really well, and it really helped me make my name. Because I wasn't just focusing on the icons. I was looking at the places that were lesser known, or maybe even lesser known parks, like the National Park of American Samoa, which is here. And I only recently, in the last few years, got to check off my national park bucket list. And that sort of caught the attention of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And so I had worked closely with Park Service on many assignments, and the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, came to me and said, well, we'd love to work with you. Your work is beautiful. And so began a relationship that started in photography and grew over many years. About 10 years I've been working with them now, along with a lot of the organizations that support them, and nonprofit organizations that support refuges and protecting refuges and other places. And so after a little bit of time, they came to me and said, well, we'd really love for you to showcase something that very few people have had the opportunity to do. And so at that point, my life really changed quite a bit. It's been about 6 years since I began that project, and it began by going to Midway Atoll. And so I have this map on the screen, so you can kind of get a little bit of sense of where this journey took me. And it ended up taking me to 3 locations on the right-hand side of your screen. Midway, which is part of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. That's a network of islands in a massive, one of the largest marine conservation areas in the world, about 1,200 miles northwest of Honolulu, Hawaii. So it's quite a long way north and west of Hawaiian Islands. It's where that little red dolphin is. It's about out there. And the only way to really get out there is either by plane to Midway or on one of the research vessels that goes out there. But there's not really a whole lot of easy ways to get out there, and it's a protected area. And so they asked me if I would go to Midway, and ended up working on that project. And they said, well, God, what you did out there for the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, which is a famous World War II battle, and I'm about to show you some images of. And they said, would you go to these other 2 places too that are also visitable? And I say that about Pacific, remote islands, and Rose Atoll because they actually have land masses that rise up above the ocean. Very little, just a little bit of sand, but they are visitable. Marianas Trench, and the last of the 5th Marine National Monument in the United States that exists off the coast of the Atlantic, those are both fully submerged. And for anybody familiar with Marianas Trench, it's the deepest part of our planet's oceans. So I think only a handful of people have ever been to the bottom of the ocean. So that was not something on my itinerary, but my itinerary did still take me to an incredible place. And that's where that first shot, the Laysan albatross we started this evening with, came from. It's from this island where a vast majority of Laysan albatross nest. And you can still see, so this is, so Midway really became famous because of the Battle of Midway in World War II. It was considered the turning point of the war in the Pacific. American forces had defeated Japanese forces. It was just movies have been made, documentaries have been made. And so we were asked to go out and tell a very interesting story, which was sort of the intertwining of natural history, the life that lives there and on and around in the surrounding reef and protected areas of Midway, as well as the human history, and interviewing those veterans who are still alive from the Battle of Midway and capturing it in their own words. But what was amazing to me was to go out there and still see the runways. You can still see the lines on the island where the planes took off during the battle. We would still go out and find, you could find anything, military shells, helmets, artillery pieces, all that, because it's a protected place. Very few people ever get to go out there. It's an extraordinarily rare opportunity. It's incredibly important for nesting seabirds, such as the short-tailed albatross that you see here, kind of a rare sighting to see on the island, in addition to the Laysan albatross. But it's also, in more recent times, become very famous because of the impacts of plastics and ocean plastics. The currents are particularly unkind to Midway, but with the plastic gyre and the Great Pacific Plastic Patch, as well as the fact that albatross travel thousands of miles in search of food, thinking that these are squid, and then eating them, they're dying. They're on their nested grounds with stomachs full of bottle caps and things like that. And so a lot of these kinds of images have unfortunately become the new reason that Midway has become more aware. But I was absolutely stunned by the amount of beauty that was there and just how much life and how important it is to wildlife. Over 250 spinner dolphins live in the lagoon. They go out and eat at night in the open ocean, but they come back to this lagoon and they're resident. And so to jump in and just be the only person with 200 dolphins and to hear their sounds in your muffled ears under the water, it's just an astounding experience, and one that's, I think, very very personal, of course, but you also try to capture that. And so for me, photography has really become in a way, for these far-flung places that are part of America's public lands and waters, it becomes a form of visitation. It's a way to go and visit this, no matter where you are. We're all visiting it right now together. And I think that makes film and photography an exceptionally powerful tool. It also really, just like data and science are so important, it helps us connect that same information we get from scientists and biologists of these places and shine a light on it. So we say, well, why is it important? And how does this science really equate or attribute to those things? This is Palmyra Atoll. It's a network of 52 islands. Like many islands in the Pacific, they were reshaped during wars and tests and all kinds of things, and then are being reclaimed by nature, as well as the organizations that help restore those places and manage them. And so this was after the success of our Midway work and film that we released for the Battle of Midway's 75th anniversary. We continued on our way to explore and document the other public lands and waters of the Pacific, Palmyra and Wake Atoll, which are part of Pacific remote islands, and just have these creatures that look like they're, characters from an animated film, but are real. This is a booby that's nesting on the island. You see the remains from World War II bunkers and things like that, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. But the opportunity to photograph, obviously, has its perks. Being able to jump in a lagoon at the end of a long, hot day filming, and then going back out into the jungle at night, is an incredible experience. But Palmyra is really exceptional in the sense that it's considered by many, especially in the shark community, to be one of the best looks at what the Pacific would look like without human impacts. It's considered the most pristine. I'm always careful about using the word pristine because there is no real such thing anymore, but it is considered the most pristine. And so when we're looking at a baseline of what should a healthy ecosystem and ocean look like in the Pacific, Palmyra Atoll is widely considered to be one of the best examples of that. And you can see why. The visibility, the clarity, the abundance of fish, the health of the corals are just tremendous. And so it really, by seeing that and being able to bring that home to people, you're able to help them understand why it is that we protect those places. And these are giant coconut crabs. They're actually called robber crabs, but they eat coconuts, so they've been nicknamed coconut crabs. And they're about the size, their bodies are about the size of a football, American football. And they crawl around mostly at night, especially after rain. They're all over Palmyra, and they're huge, and they will take a tow if you get too close. They're not trying to take a tow, but they have the second most powerful grip in the animal kingdom between a lion's jaws and an alligator's bite. And so they are not something you want to get your flip-flopped foot stuck up under in a claw while walking around filming. But we spent quite a bit of time filming them at night and during the day. There's one island in particular where there's lots of them, but they're super cool, and they're just out there living on land. They're a land crab. They don't live in the water. In fact, they would drown if they're in the water too long. So it's a really just an interesting and wild place and uninhabited. One of the things I think that's fascinating about these experiences, the number of uninhabited islands that I've had the opportunity to visit. This one is Rose Atoll. It's in the Southern Hemisphere. It's 185 miles east of American Samoa. And this atoll, this island is, you can walk around it in about 15 minutes. It's not very big. And we had a boat off outside the coral edge of the reef. And we would camp on the island, charge batteries on the boat, kind of running them back and forth, and essentially just trying to document the abundance of life here. But the islands are one thing, but there's a massive, massive protected area around all of these islands. Pacific Remote Islands, for instance, is over 490,000 square miles of protected ocean. I forget the exact numbers, but Papahanaumokuakea and the Hawaiian Islands, where Midway is about 1,200 miles long by a couple hundred miles wide. And they sound like big protected areas, but really for these ecosystems where fish and birds and seabirds nest and migrate, they really are the bare minimum of areas that are required to keep these areas healthy and to keep the species that rely on them healthy. While we were here, baby turtles were being born right there in the sand, and then would run off into the water. I have a picture coming up about that. And a lot of nesting seabirds, a lot of seabirds in general, just stay out at sea during their entire lives, except to mate and to nest, and then they go back out at sea. So these very small little patches of ground are very important to the species that call them home. One of the cool parts, I think, of this particular island, you can see we're all always pretty much trying to dodge the sun because you're out in it all day. At low tide, the water rushes out of a narrow channel in the lagoon, and it reveals these coral formations. These are upturned coral reef chunks. And then this pink stuff that you sort of see just underneath the surface of the water is called crustose coralline algae. And there's some coral growing in that. It's actually a warm water coral that's being studied as a possible way to help restore reefs in other parts of the world. But as the tide goes out, these are revealed as the tide comes in and the lagoon comes back. But when it revealed, you can actually walk around on the crustose algae. It's basically a shelf, and you've got these pools. And to me, it looked a lot like where I got my start in Yellowstone National Park and photographing the thermal features. The difference is, these you might not hesitate to jump in and enjoy. But it was just so cool to see the colors come out and to see the sort of natural shapes that are sort of replicated in nature, whether it be a hot spring in a place like Yellowstone or these lagoon pools, I guess you could call them, on Rose Atoll. There's another shot of what they look like. And they could be, 6, 7, 8 feet deep, no current in them other than the one running across the top. Water temperature is about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is what it looks like when the water comes back in, excuse me, and the lagoon starts to refill and fish come back in, and all of the life of the lagoon, sharks and things like that, all come back in. This is an area that very few people, no one really dives. In many cases, these are the first time anyone had photographed or filmed them from the air. It was the first time divers were put in the water, first time commercial film and photography had taken place. So, if you go to Google, I think if you look at Rose Atoll, you get one of my images. It's there's just so little information about it. Yet, they're there, they're out there, they're part of our public land and water. And so we saw things like this very interesting formation that our cinematographer James caught on his camera. It's just very different, unlike any other island we'd ever seen before on a trip. And just really mesmerizingly beautiful, and lots of sharks. We saw lots of sharks. Then you have to worry about them. Most of them are small little reef sharks, just nipping on the fish. We saw a lot of pillar types of coral like this. You could just see the size of it. There's a person way off to the right there diving along it. It's just a whole world below the ocean, and in a special place. I mean, to go out there. And we only had a couple of days just because it's just so hard to get there. It's hard to be there. Having the resources for camera, food, water, all those things really have to come with you. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges in general has been, how do you go out and deal with the humidity and the salt water? And it's very glamorous to talk about all this and seeing baby turtles as they run their way into the ocean to start their lives, traveling thousands of miles, by the way, 2,000-3,000 miles to Fiji and then back. to nest here, many years later, is exceptional. And the access has been incredible. But, we're also moving 400 pounds of camera gear. We're figuring out, in very limited amount of time, how do you capture a place no one's been to, that you have no real reference point when you go into. And so there were a great many challenges with bringing all that together. But I think those challenging conditions also really just make it personally so much more rewarding. And obviously, really the images and the work also about the importance of protecting them and keeping them protected, which is key. After that, we began a project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System, as well as a myriad of other partners, to begin looking at the rest of the refuge system. And so after looking at, everyone knows the national parks, a lot of people don't know the National Wildlife Refuge System, even though it's substantially larger than all of our national parks combined. When you include oceanic areas, the refuge system is some 800 million acres of ocean and land, where the parks are about 85 million. If you're just counting just refuge land, it's about 115 million acres. So even landmass to landmass, you're talking about a massive, massive protected area that are part of our public land and waters system, a network of system, but not nearly as familiar. And so that lack of familiarity became the genesis of our work of moving across different refuges over the course of a number of years, and trying to think of ways to shift the paradigm of how we think of places like our parks. And conceptually, I'm always looking at, what can I do to, as a photographer, to visually get people to engage and go, oh, that's Yellowstone, right? But this isn't Yellowstone. This is actually Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge, part of the Colorado complex of refuges. And, and the concept here too, for me, was the idea of like the old Buffalo nickels, if anybody remembers those. It's just, you get the very squared on profile of a bison. Bison is the correct word, and then the clouds were just perfect this particular day, and the color and everything was just right. And so I also this concept of how do we brand a place, and how do we change what people think they know about our protected public lands and waters. But we also got to go to a lot of really other incredible places and see a lot of amazing aspects. A lot of the refuge areas are also part of are protected under the Wilderness Act. So it's yet another overlay of protections, like the marine national monuments are overlaid with the refuges in cases. The Wilderness Act is an even greater level of protection. You can't do anything but walk into it. You can't drive into it. You can't motorized vehicle into it. You can't even fly over it. And so to get to them often is very difficult. They're in the heart of areas very, very commonly. They're not right along the road in a lot of cases. And in this particular case, this glacier, Tustamina Glacier in Alaska, Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, not to be confused with Kenai Fjords National Park, this is the other side of the hill, excuse me, is where this glacier was. And we're seeing Earth essentially born from ice for the first time on this day, as it's melting off, and hearing the glacier shape and fall, and ice falling and crystalline, and there's no people, and you're alone in this wilderness area, and it's part of the story. All of it is part of the story, but people continue to be a part of the story, and have grown, even just like they did at the beginning of my work, of continued to be a big part of it. And this is a elegant tern colony in San Diego, and there's a lot of incredible stories. This is all, I think, forget the actual populations, I think 50% or more of the entire population of this species of bird nests on this little sandbar off the coast of San Diego. So it's pretty amazing to see these things and know that they can happen right in our urban backyards, or they can happen in these far-flung places. And not all the refuges are far-flung. There's certainly some spectacular ones. One of the places that I had always wanted to go was Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. And the color and shape of their backcountry, a lot of aerial photography. I know drones are a big part of it. You're not flying a drone 180 miles into the backcountry very easily. So a lot of actual helicopters and fixed wing aircraft are needed in different places. But the diversity of the system is really incredible. This is Lake Umbagog, which is on the border of Vermont and Rhode Island. During autumn. This is also Wow, I think I actually forgot this one. No, this is an Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which I'm going to get to. That's out of order. This is more Kodiak as well. It's just spectacular. And again, you're talking about areas. Some of these areas are people who lived on Kodiak their whole lives, 30 years, and they would be like, well, I never went to that part of the refuge before. It's just people don't do it. It's this huge, vast areas covered in bears, lots and lots of grizzlies. Though we didn't see a whole lot on this particular trip. This is an old fishing shack, but we definitely saw lots of signs of them. But it really, I think the importance of sharing these areas and the importance of how they span across the nation has been very undervalued, and I hope that through photo and film we can really change that. This actually became the cover of my new book, Refuge, America's Wildest Places. And this was an aerial photo that was taken. This was a squall. I was in a little plane bumping around for quite a while over Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is always in the news. It's the old 40+ year oil exploitation refuge. I had never been there. It's actually the first refuge I ever heard of. I remember hearing of it as a kid, mostly because of the oil exploitation conversations, but I'd never seen it. And so I finally had the opportunity to go. Took days and days before we could finally get a plane up into the air and get out there. But the light that took place out there, especially in fall with the mist, and it's hard to appreciate how thick the carpet is, that tundra down below, the yellow and the texture. It's as high as my shoulders or higher in some places. And you can't even see if there's bears moving around unless they come out onto the rock. But the light and color is stunning, and it's such a ruggedly beautiful place. And just a tremendous resource for wildlife, tremendous resources for photographers certainly too, but tremendous resource for wildlife. And one of the funniest moments was we're tracking these caribou, also called reindeer, these caribou around this mountain, and I'm on the edge and I'm looking over and I see these two, and I see one kind of go off to the side, or these three rather, and I see one go off to the side, two go the other direction, and I'm like, well, if I go around this mountain, maybe I can come up on this caribou and get a better shot. It's kind of silhouetted here. It's still a cool shot. And so I go around, I'm kind of running, and it's kind of high above sea level where we were. So kind of breathing heavy and getting a lot of oxygen, and then I get around and the wind's blowing apparently the right way. And just as I come around the mountaintop, I come up over the edge, me and a caribou come face to face. And she didn't see me right away, and I had my head down as I was looking at my lens. We both kind of pick up our heads at the same time, and I'm like a matter of feet away from this thing, and all of a sudden it snorts and it's so startled it jumps on all four legs, which makes me think maybe this was Rudolph. But it literally just comes up completely in the air, all 4 feet. I managed to get one photo and then the thing runs off. But it was such a great moment and such an intimate moment. And you could see the color of the antlers, the red and the velvet is just really beautiful. But it was just one of those personal moments that I've always really appreciated and that are completely unplanned and unpredictable. Another interesting part of Arctic, in a place called Kaktovik, Alaska, which is in the farthest north area. It's like a barrow. It's one of the darkest places in the United States. In winter, I think it's dark for 30 days there without the sun ever rising. While the sea ice is forming, this new sort of phenomenon has happened. They've always been there, but never quite like this, because as the climate changes, polar bears have begun congregating, waiting for the sea ice to form. And so it's become a really great place to see polar bears. And within the United States, we're not really known for having the big sort of polar bear viewing opportunities. And so Kaktovik, Alaska, which is part of surrounded by Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, has become one of those places. So this was the first time I ever had the opportunity to photograph the polar bear and shine a light on yet another aspect of the public land system. It was an exceptionally challenging shoot. It's a very remote area. We did not have a lot of time. The sea ice, which you can see starting to form off to the right there in the background, was really cool, really dramatic. But from where we were in our opportunities to actually see polar bears and polar bear behavior, it was fairly limited amount of time. But it was yet another aspect and shined such a bright light on the diversity of the refuge system. And hang on, there we go. I had a little lag there. Oops. Sorry about that. This is another shot in Kenai. One of the other things that's been interesting is seeing how landscapes are so transformed by fires. This is actually fireweed. It was an area that had seen a lot of fire. And this was a little bit of time, a couple of years, I believe, after the fire had come through. And you could see how we had a completely different viewpoint of that area. But fires in Alaska have become more and more common now, too. I think they've had some of the largest, if not the largest, fires in their history in that area in last year. So, but, you know, a lot of big landscapes because it's my passion, but there's also really, you know, I do love the details. And part of the branding effort, we want to tell the human story to everything as well. This is Valle de Oro, which is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The wildlife story, of course, this is an Arctic fox that looks like it might be smiling, as well as just all of the different glacial areas, you know, ranging from Alaska and Kenai all the way up to the Arctic. It's just tremendous. Hard to get a sense of scale. I think that's the biggest challenge I have. Short of putting people out there, you know, some of the smallest blocks in this picture are larger than a house. It's almost impossible to get a sense of it. Here we actually did have a small drone that we were able to use, and I thought I'd be able to reach that edge of the glacier, that big edge that you see sort of on the left of the frame. And by the time I got there, I had to turn around because my battery was already gone. It took me 20 minutes to fly over there. So you can't understand the scale of some of these places unless you start to put people in it. The other trip that we went on that was really led to an incredible documentary that's out now on Discovery Plus, The Last Unknown. But we didn't really even know that this had existed. I'd seen it on maps, and until we boarded the Tekla, which is part of Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, I didn't really think much about the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And a lot like the Pacific, you know, many of them are uninhabited, and the further you get out, the more remote they are. But we had the opportunity to go out on a couple different expeditions to document them, and you know, they were places that few people, if any, had ever really been before. You know, seeing waterfalls, and this grass is waist high or higher and very difficult to walk through. The islands are volcanic. It's a network of 2,500 islands. If you're not familiar with the Aleutians, it's that little tail that comes off of Alaska and goes out into the Bering Sea. And it separates the Bering Sea from the North Pacific. It's where they film Deadliest Catch. It's very, you're in for a bit of a wild ride on the ship when you're out there. There's no docks, there's no beaches, there's no restaurants, there's no real resources, short of plenty of fresh water, often in the form of rain, usually propelled by wind. So you're in the elements a lot. But you know, the work of the biologists and field technicians out there is incredibly important. They'll live 3 to 6 months, sometimes just 2 people alone in a hut like this on an island that may be, you know, anywhere from a few square miles to 30 square miles around. To study the populations and health of wildlife. And it's an active volcanic area, and things are constantly changing. Obviously, climate and things like that are changing, but this is basically what their home looks like. And it's an amazing experience to see that. You know, after this trip and in the you know, the post-pandemic world, you start to think, oh, maybe this was the original and right idea for quarantine. I know a lot of us joked about all the islands we got to go to now seeming like they'd be a pretty good place to be during some of the worst of this. But the islands were phenomenally beautiful, and again, like a lot of the stuff in the South Pacific that we had done in the tropical coral reef areas, many of these had never been photographed before or filmed professionally, or really in any way sort of documented and shared. So yet again, another form of visitation. Our trip culminated on Boguslav Island, which is an active volcano. This is just the tip of the volcano. It's actually a massive volcano that's mostly submerged in the waters around it. And all these little things that you see around the edge in the front of the frame here by the little ponds are actually northern fur seals, along with a few stellar sea lions, which are an endangered species. And they come here because the nutrient-rich waters are fed by the active volcano. And we were able to get out and walk around out in the middle of it and look at things, check things out, bubbling pots of water and mud and all the stuff you might see in a place like Yellowstone, and explore it. And, you know, you feel really a lot like Darwin going onto these islands, you know, and each landing is really tough. The waters is Arctic waters. They're cold. You're in Arctic float suits. Raft could flip, dump you out. You're wet, cold. We're really all working together and on our own in a lot of these places. But what's interesting is we're traversing these beaches with all of our camera gear is also that there's still yet more human history here. And again, like Midway, World War II, which I did not realize the extent of it really came to the Aleutian Islands, a lot like it did in the rest of the Pacific with the Battle of Attu, which is a lot like the Battle of Midway. And you'll still see shipwrecks out on the beaches. You'll see, artillery on the hillsides, and you'll find things as though they were there yesterday, just laying there like gas masks and tubes laying in the mud as you're exploring an area that is essentially very, very, very difficult to reach. We traveled almost 3,000 miles. We never saw another boat the entire time we were out there. So you're talking about extremely remote. And that remoteness protects everything, right? It's the isolation is as its own sort of form of protection in addition to the designation that we've given it. But it also means that you're in many ways sort of like stepping back in time, like a time capsule, and seeing things like this B-24 bomber that is one of only two in the world that is in situ where it crashed over 75 years ago during World War II. Here's the cockpit of it. And this was, the pilot survived, it crashed, an emergency landing. They found this very narrow patch of land, and this is where the plane came and where it still sits today. And so the visual aspects of the history, the human history in these places, to me are a great way to sort of indicate what remoteness, what isolation, what protection can really do to keep a place untouched or relatively untouched. And currents still carry garbage with it onto the beach, but the wildlife definitely relies on these incredible places. And and the beauty of the islands to not have docks and restaurants and lights and light pollution, all the other stuff, and to have them in such a great vantage point for us to see is again yet another important baseline for us in thinking about conservation and what it means to protect places. This is a northern fur seal, and that's what these guys are on the beach. So they're big, they're very big, very ornery, grouchy. I don't want to get too close. This is a shot. You can see how many there are. About 140,000 of them on just this island alone. It's one of the largest colonies of northern fur seals in the world, and they're called fur seals because their fur used to be harvested essentially by people, and we more or less almost knocked them into extinction. They're almost completely gone. And then only through protections, I forget how many there were. There was not many. I want to say it was only a couple thousand at one point. And then if that, and then through protections, they've started to rebound, though they're starting to dip again. We saw a lot of other wildlife, these really cool looking things called auklets. These are crested auklets, punk rocker deals going on their head, which are super fun. And then just in general, for me, I think it's the personal experience of being able to go out there and really get close to nature and just better understand the natural world and how it's all connected. This is a stellar sea lion skull, kind of a fun shot. They're just so big. You don't realize how big things are. Like it seems like the scale of everything in nature seems so much larger, especially when you get a little close to it. But it's been a really fun adventure. But I encourage you to certainly. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have. I've just covered pretty much every corner of the United States. But the adventure is on Discovery. We have our show, The Last Unknown, which I definitely encourage you to check out. I'm really proud of it. It's a 42-minute show on Discovery Plus that is kind of the behind the scenes of how my process is and working in the field and the experience of seeing nature while also sharing a lot of the great moments of the seabirds and things that we saw out there. And then we have a short series called Nature in Focus as well. You can visit the URL in the middle there, discovery.com/nature in focus. And you can see all kinds of stuff. We actually have a really funny sort of outtake reel on the Aleutian Islands. I'm not, the photos present best. We're not the most graceful in the field. So I think you'd probably really enjoy checking out some of these. They're anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes or so in length. And we've shared the Pacific through an IMAX movie as well, which is mostly for the museum cinema space and is yet another way for people to connect. So I've really, tried to pair all of these things with broad audiences so that everybody has the opportunity to experience the places, and to see what our protected lands and waters are all about. And as Kate said in the beginning of this, Kate Gleason, this is all really just sort of encapsulated in my book, Refuge, America's Wildest Places. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have about the adventures that we've had. But I really do thank you, and hope that you'll stay in touch.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try and moderate some questions, but I have to say I have to catch my breath. I'm a little speechless by all the images we just saw. I know when you were previewing this for us before we hopped on live, I was audibly oohing and eyeing, and I'm sure many people at home are doing the same thing as you just took us on that journey. So thank you so much. It was such beauty, but such also information and education. So let's dive in. Again, people are free to use the Q&A. Just type your question and we'll do as many as we can. The first couple we've got are really seems to be from the photographers in our midst.
Sure.
The first one is, your images are fantastic. Thanks for sharing. What type of camera equipment do you travel with? And do you have a favorite camera that you use the most often?
It's changed a lot. I definitely have my go-to camera systems. Still photography, almost everything you saw here today. In fact, I can't think of anything that's not, for the most part, shot, I would say, on the Canon 5D Mark IV. So I still use a digital DSLR, interchangeable lenses. And a lot of people are using mirrorless. Those look great. I don't have a real reason to change. I'm really satisfied with the results I'm getting. But from a filmmaker standpoint, some stills are pulled from drone occasionally because it's the only thing, only way we can get that perspective of an island that's uninhabited, and you can't get up over a 100-foot cliff. That might be the way to do it. So drones are definitely a little bit part of it. We have an Inspire 2 drone. But from a filmmaking standpoint, we have a litany of different things. We've used everything from iPhone footage in our television shows to GoPros to big red digital cinema cameras, which is our go-to digital cinema system. But lots of different lenses, way too much gear at times. We try to keep it simple, but we've done entire shoots, film shoots, video shoots, climbing a mountain with just a couple GoPros and an iPhone. So it really just depends on what's best for the situation. But when really trying to capture these magnificent images and have the best quality, and especially places where you're not maybe ever going to get to go again in a lot of these cases, or maybe nobody else is at any time real soon either. We try to strive for having the best quality we can afford. That way we can make this stuff really last over many years.
Yeah, great. So this one is, speaking as a landscape photographer, not a filmmaker, can you share your revenue streams with us? Where do you sell most of your images? Where do you sell most frequently? Curious to how you turn landscape imagery into a job.
Yeah, that's why I'm here hawking my books tonight, right? Is that's part of it. It's a difficult one. I mean, I've been very, very, very fortunate to, I've been doing it a long time, and I've been very fortunate and working very hard at it. And it's not just me. I've got a whole team of people. I've got somebody next to me now who goes with me everywhere as well. I mean, it's a whole team of people that have really built things like our shows and films. But I started slow. As a landscape photographer, it was calendars, magazines, eventually books, which, they're not going to retire from a book. You're not going to be lucky if you actually, pay a month of a mortgage really with the revenue from a book. They're not huge money makers, but you have to do a little bit of all of it, right? It's a little bit of publishing, a little bit of maybe commercial work. Your image might work for a bank or an ad or something that pays a little more. And then just depending on what your interests are. I mean, for me, it's like I love storytelling more than anything else. So in many cases, the revenue sort of follows the passion. And so, but I would say it is very difficult. But we have an incredible photo agency called Tandem that licenses work. We represent over 300 photographers around the world in the outdoor space, tandemstock.com. And so, that might be a good fit for you too. But I started local and shot for years locally on issues that were important to me or close to me, or things I just enjoyed, cool lakes and mountains that, could get published. And, with each little bit, I added more camera gear, and more camera gear became a whole career eventually.
Well, and you talk about your crew. How big is your crew typically when you go to maybe some of those more remote places? How many people are we talking?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends. I mean, I'm almost always with at least one other. In a lot of cases, I'd say on the biggest expeditions, it's no more than about 4 people.
Okay.
But there's 4 on the film photography audio side, and then in a lot of cases, like a lot of our show was only filmed with 3 people
Mhm.
for that hour on Discovery. So it really depends. 3 or 4, a fourth sometimes. But we also had biologists and people helping us or helping move gear onto the beach. There were, first mates and deckhands on the boat. There was somebody else cooking food. There's scientists who are helping guide to make sure we're pointed in the right direction. And, there were 15 of us on the boat that we were all in many ways helping each other, making sure that they have things. If they're carrying my camera box onto the beach, we're also going to be lifting, the gear that they need to build their field camp.
Yeah.
So it really, when you're out there, it's a team effort. But my core team in the field is about 4 people. But then we also have our editors and post-production people who are critical to telling the story because I have no patience to edit. And so they also are part of putting all of that together and taking what we do and interpreting it into a story that becomes enjoyable for everybody at home.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so if Zoom is good for anything, it's that we get to kind of spy into your background. Somebody wanted to ask, what are the pictures behind you? I assume there's some of your favorites. Is that right? Is that some of your own work?
It's actually project posters. So I've got our project. So we did a film on Midway called Midway: Edge of Tomorrow, which if you're a member of Amazon Prime, it's free to watch. So we have the Midway poster. Our first film that we ever did is a 5-minute film that did really well in festivals and the shorts called Chasing the Distance. It's about an ultra runner. And then that's a Shark Week poster. So I produced an episode of Shark Week about Cuba for Discovery Channel about 6 years ago now. And I actually have a new Shark Week show, digital show on discovery.com right now too. And so that Shark Week was a big turning point in my television career, I guess you can call it. And so, and I've got actually 2 more posters on the way. So I'm hoping to add to it. I've got our Last Unknown poster coming. I have a frame coming for it. And then I've got our Hidden Pacific poster that's going to get put here. Since we're getting the tour, I'll give you the whole tour, right? So,
yes, absolutely. Oh, that's great.
right? It's kind of cool.
Your greatest hits.
Yes, the greatest hits. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So the next question we have what kind of permissions do you have to get to go to those places? And I know, who do you work with to secure those permissions and how do you get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have been slowly getting to that point, right? So we have a lot of experience working with endangered species. All of the places that we go, we follow what are called special use permits or have some sort of paperwork that we have to apply for. They do things called compatibility determinations to say, is the filmmaking compatible with our mission to protect the wildlife? Is there a way to do it with no impact? If in the rare instance we're allowed to use a drone, which we rarely are not, but if we are, all of that is assessed first. Is it safe? How low can we go? What areas can we fly? All of that. So it's really a process. But because I have worked so closely with these groups for almost 2 decades now, there's also an immense amount of trust. So you don't just walk in and say one day you want to do, the most extreme place on Earth. It's something that we've worked towards and have proven that we're responsible in making sure that the mission of Wildlife First, in the case of National Wildlife Refuges, is protected above all else, above all aspects of the filmmaking process. But each refuge has its own process. A lot of places you don't need to do anything, depending on what it is that you're doing. But it is technical, but that's also a big part of why we almost always have a biologist with us. So a lot of the people that you see in the photos are actually like what I call our handlers. Don't walk there, don't step on this, that kind of stuff. So, but it's a career, right? So I mean, it's like a technical career, and so you're very mindful of those processes.
Yeah. Here at the Garden, we call that our hort crew.
Yeah, exactly.
So just a question, you were talking about, the permissions. Just can you kind of summarize again, what is the Natural Wildlife Refuge System?
Sure.
I think we talked a little bit about it, but maybe a little more in depth.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So the National Wildlife Refuge System is the largest network of public lands and waters in the world. So it's essentially about 800 million acres of ocean and land. And the mission of the National Wildlife Refuge System is essentially to protect wildlife first. So if you're thinking about it in the context of, well, you've got a national park, a national wildlife, a national forest, we have all these national branches of public lands. A national park is essentially to protect places for future generations. And so their mission is a little different. It's about protecting a place. It's about protecting the visitor experience so that future generations can go and enjoy El Capitan or Old Faithful the same way they did 100 years ago. The refuge system very much intertwines people with their mission, especially now, because inevitably we become, more populated, more busy. But it's wildlife first. So that's what the mission is. The first National Wildlife Refuge was Pelican Island. It was started because they realized back then that the birds were being over harvested for feathers and hats at the time, which were trendy, and they were essentially wiping out that particular species. And so they said, well, let's protect that species by protecting this place. And born was the National Wildlife Refuge System. One of the interesting things that a lot of people may not realize is that unlike, you can fish in a lot of national parks and there are some exceptions to hunting rules, but wildlife refuges, a lot of them do have a significant amount of hunting and fishing that are part of it. But I forget the exact statistic, but it's a large percent, 80%, I want to say, of revenue in managing or protecting those refuges comes from the taxes associated with things like the duck stamp or fishing, like from organizations like Trout Unlimited or Ducks Unlimited and things like that. And so, it is a little bit different in how obviously it has public funds as well, but it is managed a little different in that it does allow certain kinds of access to it.
Great. So
and there's 567 refuges versus I forget the number now because we added some, right? 58 national parks, I think, are there.
Yeah, and as you said, the acreage is so impressive.
Yes, yeah, the acreage is impressive, in considering, there are urban refuges, so there are a number of refuges that are close to major metropolitan areas: Albuquerque, Seattle, Portland, Philadelphia, Miami, New Orleans. We've got LA even doesn't have a refuge, it's got a lot of work around the LA River, San Diego, Denver. They have Detroit, Minnesota, Min Valley, National Wildlife Refuge, where you can have a lot of these big experiences. Albuquerque is an interesting, or not Albuquerque, but I'm sorry, New Mexico is interesting. There's the Bosque del Apache, which is a very famous refuge where the bird migration comes in, and it's an Arctic migration, and so it's really an opportunity in New Mexico to have an Arctic experience where you see snow geese that have come all the way down, that are on their way to, to southern winter grounds, but they stop, en masse by the tens of thousands, and it's just a spectacle as they fill the sky. So a lot of the refuges are important to migratory birds. Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a big overlay to the refuge system as well. And refuges have been for many years very closely equated with birding and bird watching. Obviously, they're founded in many ways in protecting birds. But that was a big part of my goal, was to not just be bird oriented, but show the diversity of wildlife, from polar bears to caribou to fox, that exist in the refuge system.
That's great. So a couple questions about talking about the effects of climate change that you've seen in your decades of work. Obviously, it's probably been very notable. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. A lot of it tends to be anecdotal, especially from people that you visit with, right? So I'm going to a lot of places and I'm often a visitor there for a very narrow window of time. And so I like to tell people, as a photographer, it can be very difficult to visually represent and show something like climate change, unless you're showing, an actual damage like plastic in the stomach of an albatross, or there's a reason the iconic polar bear on an iceberg is become the image. There's not really like one thing that you can point to and say visually there it all is. It's something that you hear from people on the ground who say, well, I used to hear the trees split apart and the ice cold of, as the ice formed inside them in the cold of winter. And I remember when the porcupines used to come through, and now they don't. And none of those things are happening anymore. And so you tend to hear climate change a lot on the ground when you're meeting and working with people who've lived there their whole lives in many cases, or have been studying an area and been visiting it repeatedly. But That's the one thing I would say that really resonated in our work, is working especially with fish and wildlife field technicians in places like Alaska Maritime. They would talk about how, well, one year is a good year and the next year is a bad year and the worst we've ever seen, and the next year is not so bad. And they're really looking at those long-term data sets. They're looking for trends to say, is it going this way because it, it does fluctuate, or is it fine, or is it stable? And that's why the work is very important that they do, and why it needs to happen so regularly. So really, I'm looking at a lot of places in just a window in time, a moment in time. But you inevitably you do see a lot of things. I notice personally things happening later or not at all, especially as it pertains to either animal behaviors or weather. And as a photographer, you can become very, especially if you're very spending a lot of time with a lot of the same species and things, you may notice a flower, coming a lot later in an area, or in an area that never was, or other species like pica, that are getting higher and higher, or disappearing from areas that you photographed them for years. There have been definitely lots of things like that. We spent a lot of time roaming around on glaciers and going under them, and they're all melting when you're near them, but you're not really going to see that unless you go back to the same glacier in time and time again to really understand the trajectory of that. So it's a tricky thing to answer. There's the obvious visuals. There's the garbage on beaches, that is unbelievable, the amount of stuff that you see just washing up on beaches all the time. That's sort of heartbreaking to see, especially nets and animals and things just caught in it. But it's there's no doubt that there's a lot of stuff going on.
Absolutely. Okay, so a couple going back to some technical questions about your photography. For
Sure.
landscape, do you use a tripod in the field?
More or less, yes. Where possible, the faster ISOs of the new cameras have been pretty lovely for being able to do a lot more handheld, which is very liberating because you have much more compositional freedom to move around versus being fixed. But I'm sort of old-fashioned. I like the tripod. I think it slows the process down, allows you to really compose the image, look at all the areas of the frame. I always say photography is the opposite of painting. You're adding to a canvas, and when you paint photography, you're taking away from the canvas. You're eliminating things you don't need, simplifying the scene, making sure there's not a power line going through a corner, or a bird flying on the edge of the frame, or whatever. I'm a bit of a purist. I wouldn't remove that later. So I'm always looking at how to simplify my image to convey a story.
Great.
Yes.
And what is your preferred post-processing software?
I'm definitely in Photoshop. I use Bridge or Lightroom and bring everything in, but it's mostly, I usually only do 5 steps. I check my levels. I shoot in RAW format, so I resaturate the images from the neutral tone I shoot them in. I will maybe add a little bit of contrast, usually in the levels process, and then I just sharpen them. I don't really do anything else. If there's color balance is a little funky, then I might do something with that. That's a very similar approach to what we do in filmmaking. So I'm actually doing a ton of filmmaking, and I'm doing a lot of color correction on that. I enjoy it. I like color correction. I know some people don't. I actually enjoy the post-process quite a bit. And so it's actually very similar steps, just sort of resaturating the images, fixing your levels and curves, and making it all look the way you saw it, really.
Great. What is your thought on social media? Is it worth the effort? I follow. I can tell you it's definitely worth a follow.
Yeah, I've got my name down at the bottom there for a reason. Yeah, it's worth the effort. I mean, I'm definitely not the best at it, but here's the thing. I mean, I think I benefit from having started when it wasn't make or break on that. I also find that social media, because of algorithms, it can funnel people or drive them into into these verticals that they don't really ever come out of. And so you don't have that opportunity to, unless you're explicitly going out and exploring other areas or locations or themes, it's very easy to fall into the same old stuff. But we find a lot of talent that we work with, and a lot of people we work with on social media. We actually just did a project in Texas where the woman we found, an incredibly talented interior designer, we found her on social media. And her work was great. And so social media is an opportunity, I think. Like, do you have to post 3 times a day and do, who knows, whatever. I barely post more than once a month some days, but some months. But it's an opportunity to let people know who you are, I think, on a more than one level of just your library or your collection of work, but an opportunity to let them know your personality and see what you're about. And I think that's a really nice thing.
All right, so we'll kind of end with a few questions put a different way. A lot of questions about your favorite place to visit and photograph. Some about the most dangerous, when you felt the most in danger when photographing. And then what's still on your bucket list? Besides the Missouri Botanical Garden, we'd love to get you here, but what's still on your bucket list to photograph?
Well, let's see. Favorite place is always hard. I always say wherever I was last. And it's also like favorite images or whatever I photographed last as well. It's just one of those
recency.
things. Looking at the same old stuff over after a while too. I'm also really driven by curiosity. Like I love exploration. Like the camera is just a reason to go places. I'm actually not. I wouldn't consider myself somebody who's like a super enthusiast with cameras, and I'm not like everyone would be like, "What camera should I buy?" I'm like, I have no idea what the new thing is. Like for me, it's more about the place, the exploration, the adventure. I'd say, I've gone to a lot of places in the United States. I have gone out of the country, not lately all that much, on assignment. I did in the earlier part of my career, a lot of stuff in coral reefs and underwater areas, but not so much lately. But I would say, I love the Channel Islands here in California. I've really, really enjoyed Alaska, tremendous amount of visual just feasts in Alaska. It's hard to go wrong there, and been fortunate to go quite a bit. Similarly, Alaska would fall into the dangerous territory. I think, climbing Denali or climbing any big mountain, I think anytime you get in a small airplane or a helicopter and you land on a glacier, or you're on a ship in the middle of the Bering Sea or an island where you could slip and fall into a volcano, I think you always kind of get, some bit of risk there. Knock on wood, we haven't even so much as broke a bone on any of our trips, let alone had any damage. A couple cameras have not ended so well. They've met their maker, so to speak, out there. But we've been very fortunate. But we're also very slow and methodical. Of safety first before getting the shot. So I think that's really paid off for us. But places I'd like to go, that's interesting. It's hard to say. I mean, there's so many beautiful places in the world I'd love to go. Australia, the Philippines would be amazing. Is a stunningly beautiful country that I would love to explore, both especially the marine habitat there. Australia, as I mentioned, but I also really love the deep sea. And so I've been looking at some projects to go out on deep ocean explorers and deep submersibles and things like that to kind of see, some of the features that exist there. But my colleague loves being on boats in open, rough oceans. So as often as I can put him, he's sitting next to me shaking his head right now because he doesn't do so well on them.
Okay, we've got a final couple quick little questions and then we will let you go. But have you done work in the Ozarks ever?
I have, actually. The Ozarks, I've done a number of projects actually there, but we've been doing some work there on and off lately, actually. So there's a project I can't really say too much about. But it is overlapping with a branch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where we're looking at working with private landowners. It's actually called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife. It's a really cool program. I didn't even know existed within Fish and Wildlife Service, and they work with private landowners to help restore areas in the country, and whether that's for a specific species or type of ecosystem, like a stream. And so I've just started learning about and documenting that, and some of that work has brought us to different parts of the Ozarks. Yeah.
Great. And then a final question: has the coral in Tonga survived?
Has the coral, what's that?
In Tonga survived?
I haven't been to Tonga, so I don't know. I know the areas that, and I'm not particularly familiar with I know I've seen a little bit about it, but I'm not familiar enough to really speak about it. But a lot of the places we were at were doing really well in the Pacific. Rose Atoll, part of the work we were doing was to actually put monitoring devices on the corals, because the corals were in water, 3 feet deep at most. And so, especially at low tide. And so the water got really hot during the day. It'd be like that for 8 hours under the sun until the tide would come back. So they started monitoring that because the coral's doing just fine. And so there's been a lot of interesting conversations about, well, why are those corals doing well and others are dying off? And is there a way to maybe, is there something we can learn about resilience essentially with corals in those areas? So I don't really know, but American Samoa, we definitely saw a little more bleaching. on the island of Ofu, where the national park is. We were trying to think of other places. I was in Palau, on the edge of the Micronesia, really. It's called the Micronesia Triangle, right? Coral Triangle. There was a lot of bleaching there. I know they've had some pretty devastating events, and I know that the Great Barrier is getting quote unquote raked over the coals by climate change as well. So, I think it really depends on the areas, but Palmyra, a lot of the stuff in the central areas, Midway actually had cold water corals, which were doing fairly well, but I'd be curious to see how they do long-term, because they're right on the edge of what it means to be cold water coral. And the Aleutian Islands as well is another thing that people don't realize. We went to the islands, but there's this incredible marine ecosystem around it, and there are cold water corals and a lot of sponges and a whole submerged world there that is very little is known about. And my understanding is they've managed to stay pretty healthy too. So, but yeah, I don't know about Tonga in particular.
Okay. Well, our final comment and quick question. The comment is work of wonder with an exclamation point. And just your next expedition, at least the one that you can share with us. What's next for you?
I appreciate it. Well, let's see, what is next? Actually, great question. I don't I've been so busy talking about what we've been doing. What's next? Oh yeah, so I'm actually working on a really cool project about how animals see the world through their eyes. And so it's a very technical project. We're using some incredibly state-of-the-art equipment and techniques with the invisible light spectrum. So we're looking at both visible light and invisible light, and what we're learning in this process. This is a very big research and development process leading up to the photography and filmmaking side. Is that there's an entire hidden world around us that we don't see, that animals see every day, birds, insects, mammals, and things like that. But a lot of it we really don't understand. And so that's a project that we're working on now, and it's starting to come forward. And it's looking at different species really all over the world. From Africa to right here in California. Great.
Well, thank you, Ian. I think we'll wrap up. We've kept you long enough, but this was fantastic. Like I said, it gave me goosebumps, and I had goosebumps throughout the questions too. Here's another comment. Thank you for a fascinating hour of armchair traveling. I agree. That's the best vacation I'm going to get this summer. So thank you so much. Thank you all of you at home for tuning in, and we'll see you on August 3rd for our next speaker series. Have a great evening, everybody. Thanks again, Ian.
Thank you.
Bye.